Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on Can Parole Be Rehabilitated? My name is Becky Feldman, and I'm the director of the Second Look Network at the Sentencing Project. I am really honored to present to you the panelists that we have for today's webinar. I'm going to introduce them briefly and then give you an overview of today's event. Joining us today is Ben Austen. He is a journalist from Chicago and the author of Correction, Parole, Prison, and the Possibility of Change, which was named one of the best books of 2023 by the Washington Post. This book is an exploration of a behind-the-scenes look at the parole process, told through the portraits of two men imprisoned for murder and the parole board that holds their freedom in the balance. His feature writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, GQ, Wired, and many other publications. He is the writer and host of the upcoming Audible Originals podcasts, The Last Days of Cabrini Green and The Parole Room. And he is the co-host with his best friend, Khalil Gibran Muhammad, of the podcast, Some of My Best Friends Are. Thanks, Ben, for joining us. Lisa Daniels is a dedicated advocate for restorative justice and pain transformation, driven by the tragic loss of her son, Darren, to gun violence in 2012. As the founder and executive director of the Darren B. Easterling Center for Restorative Practices, she advances trauma-informed solutions to help communities of color affected by violent crime and mass incarceration. She is also a former parole board member of the Illinois Parole Commission and currently serves on the Council on Criminal Justice and the Illinois Sentencing Advisory Council. Michelle Lewin is an attorney in New York State. Born and raised in Atlanta, Michelle has been active in anti-incarceration work since 2005. She is now the executive director of the Parole Prep Project, training hundreds of volunteers and working alongside people serving life sentences in New York State prisons in their struggle for parole release. She is a co-author of Collaborating Across the Walls, a community approach to parole justice, which was published in 2017. Lastly, Anthony Muhammad is an advisor to the Maryland Parole Partnership at the ACLU of Maryland, where he assists in all aspects of program development and is passionate about improving access to counsel for people serving extreme sentences. He also works as a youth mentor with Baltimore Brothers, a youth mentorship program that teaches manhood training to at-risk youth in Baltimore City. Anthony is also a survivor of Maryland's prison system, sentenced to life with parole plus 20 years for homicide offenses that occurred when he was 15 years old. He served over 29 years before his remarkable record of transformation earned him his release under Maryland's Second Look Law on September 20th, 2022. Welcome to you all, and thank you so much for joining us. Today's webinar is going to be a discussion about America's parole system, how it started as a system to promote and judge rehabilitation, and how it's evolved from that premise. Panelists will also discuss whether the system can be rehabilitated, meaning, are parole boards able to determine true readiness for release, or has the parole system been relegated to acts of mercy? I think you might be surprised by some of these answers. Lastly, we will also discuss concepts of restorative justice and how to engage victims in a review process that is trauma-informed. So we want to hear from you as well. So we will have several of these anonymous polls throughout the hour. If you have specific questions for the panel, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we hope to be able to answer some of these questions at the end of the hour. Feel free to use the chat, as I see you all are doing, to give us live feedback, to introduce yourselves, or even to ask questions amongst each other. We want this to be helpful and informative for everybody. So the first thing I want you all to put in the chat, for those it applies to, is if you are a friend or family member of someone who is incarcerated, please tell us in which state and for how long they've been incarcerated. And while you do that, I'm going to start with a question for Ben Austen. Ben, it was your book, which we've read at the Sentencing Project, that's inspired this webinar today, Correction, Prison, and the possibility of change. This book goes through a really detailed history of how and why the concept of parole came about in the early 1900s. So can you talk a bit about that history?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Becky. First, I want to thank the Sentencing Project for hosting this webinar, this panel, but really for everything you do. For me, for journalists everywhere, probably for everybody who works in criminal justice work in any way, we rely on the work of the Sentencing Project. And thank you to the other panelists. It's such an honor to be here with you. Some of you I relied on as I worked on this book, and others I'm meeting today or I met working on this. So thank you. Uh, your question is a good one. I mean, I'll say one of the big reasons I worked on this book about parole, which is like in some ways the backwaters of the criminal justice system, is that it tells the bigger story of the entire history of prisons in the United States and really what we're doing today, like what we believe punishment is for. It's that exploration. And so, yes, parole started as a reform, and that's important to note. It started as a reform to a penitentiary system that didn't work. And it started in the late 18th century, so like in the 1890s, right around the 1900, with an idea that prisons need to do more than warehouse folks and seek revenge. A belief in rehabilitation, really. And so the logic was that if prisons are supposed to be about rehabilitation, how should we evaluate rehabilitation? Could it be figured out at the time of sentencing by a judge when they don't know what's going to happen in the future? They don't know what someone's going to be like in 5 years or 10 years or however long. Or should create a system, a group of people who will reevaluate someone again and again over time. And that became what a parole board is. We're going to come back and see how you're doing. You know, are you a safe bet at this point to return to society? With a kind of like step system, you know, where you like can improve, like, you know, you can go from a maximum security prison to down to a minimum one and then earn your way out. That is so logical in so many ways. It's, you know, probably everyone on this webinar would agree, like fundamentally, it's about a belief that people change, that over time, you know, you're not defined by your worst thing. That's so true and logical that it became the law of the land, and really every state and the federal system adopt indeterminate sentences, whereby a parole board is going to decide when somebody gets out. And as we'll talk about more, like over the decades, this belief that this system did not work, that the parole system was not an effective reform, that reform actually needed to be reformed. And by the 1960s and the 1970s, you have people in prison advocating for the end of the parole system. People in prison who are sentenced to indeterminate sentences, and the idea that not believing that a parole board will ever let them out, that parole boards might be racist or sexist or just lazy or believe in permanent punishment. And therefore, if you have an indeterminate sentence, you know, where you would get heard in 10 years, but it might be 199 years, like these kind of biblical times, you're never going to get out. And so eventually, actually, conservatives agree that they don't like the parole system, but for a different reason. They don't like any sort of systems of release. They think they're soft on crime. And beginning in the 1970s, 16 states eventually, and the federal system eventually abolished their parole systems. And, you know, so today, far fewer people in this country have a chance to come before a parole board.
Thank you for that explanation, Ben. Next, I have a question for Anthony. Anthony, you have been through the parole process and you've been through the second look process. You weren't paroled, you got out through the second look law. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about both of those experiences.
Yes, ma'am, I can. Thank you. I want to begin by, of course, saying I'm honored to be here, of course, with our distinguished host, Mrs. Becky Feldman, who I've known over the last several years through different aspects of her very distinguished career. And I'm honored to be here with this distinguished panel as well. As Becky mentioned in her opening, in January 1993, I was arrested for 2 homicide charges in the city of Baltimore. I was ultimately convicted and sentenced to life plus 20 years in prison. The judge who sentenced me mistakenly believed that I was unredeemable, unreformable, and that the crimes that I committed were unreconcilable. Despite the fact that I had no prior adult criminal record, and one very minor juvenile offense, she somehow believed that education, job training, and things of that nature would never make me a safe citizen again. But thankfully, the judge who sentenced me was all wrong about me. And about a year and a half ago, I was released under the Maryland Juvenile Restoration Act, or the JRA as we call it, which is the first form of second look law enacted here in the state of Maryland, which gave offenders who were convicted as juveniles, as adults, as juveniles, the opportunity to petition the court for a modification of their sentence if they had served a minimum of 20 years of incarceration and could prove that they had matured and rehabilitated and that they were no longer a threat to public safety. Thankfully, the judge who released me under the JRA said the exact opposite about me than the judge who sentenced me. In fact, the judge who released me said that in all of her years on the bench, I was the first violent offender that she had absolutely no reservations about releasing back into the community, based upon my remarkable record of demonstrated maturity and rehabilitation. Simultaneously, after the passing of the JRA in 2019 by the Maryland General Assembly, at that time I was also involved in the Maryland parole process. I had just been recommended for parole in the first step or stage of the parole process for people who were serving life sentences. So I was transitioning through the Maryland parole process and the second look JRA process simultaneously. And it was just a question of which hearing would come first, which examination would come first, either the court hearing of the JRA or the release after the risk assessment evaluation through the parole process. Thankfully, the JRA process came first because it comes without a lengthy period of parole for the rest of my life. So I was thankfully released under the JRA about a year and a half ago.
Thank you, Anthony, and welcome home. And thanks for all these great chats that are going. So I have a question now for the audience. We're talking a little bit about second look laws, and what they are generally is something that a law that the legislature passes that allows someone who's been incarcerated for usually a lengthy period of time, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, to go before a judge for reconsideration of sentence. So my question to you all is, do you know how many states have second look laws on the books? Just put your answers in the chat, and then I'll give you the answer also in the chat, so pay attention. Okay, so my next question is for Michelle. Michelle, in New York, parole eligible people are not entitled to counsel, and attorneys are not permitted in the parole interview. Are advocates pushing for legal representation in parole hearings? Why or why not?
Great question. First, just thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the other panelists. I love this group of people. I could spend all day talking to them and hearing about their experiences. It's very moving. I also just want to acknowledge in the chat, like earlier when you sort of asked, who has friends or family or loved ones or themselves were incarcerated. And I mean, there was probably thousands of years cumulatively in the chat, right, between everybody who chimed in. And I don't know, I just find that very overwhelming and really devastating, right? Just like the many, many thousands of years that people have spent behind bars when they could be out here with their loved ones. But to your question, I get this question a lot, like, would the parole process be improved? Would outcomes be improved if people in New York had access to representation, like by legal counsel, both, in preparation for the interview, but also during the interview itself? And I'm really careful not to call New York State parole process a hearing, because I think a hearing sort of implies this like very formal procedure where somebody can cross-examine witnesses and bring in additional evidence. And New York is very much just an interview in the sense of, you have parole commissioners sitting on one side of a video screen, video conferencing into a prison, asking questions and sort of interrogating people who are up for parole that month. And so I think for me, like, as much as I love the idea of counsel coming in and potentially creating more protections for incarcerated people, I actually think that it elevates the proceeding to a more adversarial space that could potentially, I think, work very much against the people that we're representing and advocating for. I think it would mean that potentially, more special interest groups could come and testify against the incarcerated person and why, and sort of explain why they shouldn't be released. It gives the opportunity, I think, for the district attorney to have greater involvement. And I think it just really, I think, opens up the parole process for a lot more adversarial proceeding and a lot more difficulty and more obstacles for people inside to get out. So certainly, right, I'm a big advocate of preparation support for people who are in prison, who are serving life sentences, and anybody going before parole. And I don't think that you have to necessarily be a lawyer to do that work and to do it well. And so, yeah, I think I would say that if anything, adding counsel to the process would sort of formalize it more, maybe re-entrench it into the system more. And also, I don't want to spend more resources on parole. I just want people to get out. I want people to be granted parole as opposed to finding money to hire them lawyers. So I think our efforts are better served advocating for people's release and for policy changes than for representation and counsel.
Thanks for that answer, Michelle. And actually, I have a quick follow-up for you because I saw that the people that your organization represents and the people that you've trained to represent incarcerated people, you get a much better parole grant outcome than if the person goes without support. So can you tell us why is that? And what's the, I guess, is there a magic ingredient?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Just to give some quick context. So the Parole Preparation Project works with people in New York State who are serving life sentences. And basically we train community volunteers, mostly people who are not lawyers and aren't really in the legal field at all, to partner with people in prison as they're preparing to go before the parole board. So working with people to prep for the actual interview itself with commissioners, but then also putting together what we call a parole packet, which is probably the name for it in many states, right? It's just like a collection of written materials about the incarcerated person that we submit to the parole board. So I think the written packet itself has a huge impact. I think oftentimes those packets include letters of support from family members and friends, letters of support from clergy in prison or from other incarcerated people who this person mentored. They include certificates and release plans. And I think the packet itself, if the commissioners read it, which I think sometimes they do, certainly not always, but when we're able to get them to read it, the packet can be very influential and I think really highlight, why this person is ready to return home, who their community is that they're going back to, all the loved ones they have in their life that will support them. And then I think the other piece of it is the interview prep, is prepping someone for the actual interview with parole commissioners. At least in New York, the process of the parole interview can be very, very, very painful, very humiliating, very degrading. The commissioners, especially commissioners who kind of aren't trained in trauma-informed care, trauma-informed interviewing, ask very pointed questions that often feel like interrogations and would put anyone, I think, on the defense or really make anyone uncomfortable talking about what is often, the most traumatizing moment in most people's lives. And so I think why preparation work is so effective is we are working with people to tell their stories in a context that is very, very high stakes, that is very, like, oftentimes painful, re-traumatizing. And so helping people prepare for that moment and supporting people in that emotional journey of getting ready for it, I think does change outcomes. And I think also people knowing that there are advocates on their side who are thinking of them, who are showing them love and compassion and like a lot of faith in their ability to get out. I think that also changes things. And I think too, for many of the people that we work with who are serving life sentences, the last time some people talked about their crime of conviction was 30 years ago with their defense attorney. And the strategy at the trial level is to kind of minimize one's responsibility so that you can get the lowest sentence possible. But in parole, it's almost reverse, right? Like the parole board wants to hear you take full responsibility for the things that you have been convicted of. And so I think helping people understand that difference and, listen, people in prison are the experts in parole. They know the best about how to navigate. But I think sometimes having an outside perspective to just say, listen, I think this is the framework that we're trying to aim for or go for can really make a big difference. Lots more to say about that, but that's kind of the gist of it.
Thanks, Michelle. Lisa, I have a question for you next. As a former parole board member, you have experienced this system up close. Hearings are sometimes hyper-focused on the facts of the crime, which we were just talking about. Has that been your experience? And to what extent should the nature of the crime be a factor in parole consideration?
Hi, Becky. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I really am honored to be here and sitting next to my friend Ben here and everyone else on the panel. Yes, that has been my experience. I served on the Illinois Prisoner Review Board until January of 2023. And I think one of the biggest challenges was to sit in deliberation for a person who has presented themselves in all of the ways that we as a state in Illinois ask that they present with a parole plan, with a solid plan, with family support, with all of the documentation to give any indication or all indications that they have been reformed and changed in throughout the time of their incarceration, only to have a colleague say, "Well, I'm just struggling with the crime. I'm still struggling with what they did. I don't know how to get past that." And we're talking, 20, 30, 40 years in, and I mean that legitimately. And no other reason, an excellent disciplinary record, all of the things, again, that all of the criteria that we would consider to consider this person's motion to be released a grantable, approvable motion. And again, only for one or two members to say, I'm just still struggling with that, was to say the least, the bane of my existence throughout my experience as a parole board member. To your question, to what extent should the nature of the crime be considered a factor? Only to the extent that it's used to measure the growth of the individual throughout their incarceral experience and nothing else. I don't think that we want to look at what that person did solely for the sake of recommending continued punishment, but we want to look at it as a gauge to say, okay, are they that person? Are how far removed are they from being that person that committed that crime 20, 30, 40 years ago? Yeah.
Yes, thank you for that answer. And Ben, let me just ask you, you watched two men go through this process. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And they were both given parole eventually.
I actually I wanted to follow up with what Lisa said anyway, because I got to watch Lisa in action. Before we were friends, I was a reporter setting up my microphone on the table in front of all the parole board members, and Lisa was on the board. Even though Illinois, where I live and where Lisa worked, abolished parole in 1978, they're basically seeing parole cases of people convicted before then. So everyone is at least served at 40 years at this point. And I just want to say what it was like to watch Lisa and to what it means who was on the board, of how important that is. Lisa represented sort of like on the political spectrum, probably one spectrum all the way to the left, and spoke up when, a belief in rehabilitation and restorative justice, and speaks as a crime victim herself. But advocating for release. And there were other members of the board often who had worked in law enforcement, and it would be so powerful to hear them talk and have different views. I remember Lisa telling me about her very first case where somebody said she's just not feeling it in terms of release, and Lisa challenging that person. "You're not feeling it? How come?" and that person got out. Like the difference of who is on the board determining justice being both totally arbitrary, but yeah. And so just, just powerful to see. And in a way that kind of supports what Michelle is saying too about that the system is really frustrating and what it means to invest more in it. But I will add, like listening to Michelle talk and all my observations, you were hearing, Michelle's work of talking even about like prepping people and people getting ready for this sounded a lot like trauma care and dealing with past and getting ready. Like it sounded like rehabilitation. Now that should be happening on day one of somebody entering incarceration. Like that should be the purpose of what we're doing. We don't do that. But, I subtitle the book, this possibility that is of change inside of this parole system, because I'm hearing all of like the kernels of what like a better system of justice would look like. Even when we're highlighting, I literally can talk all day or write a whole book about how messed up parole is and unjust and unfair. I did, but we're also hearing some kind of possibility of change in it. And Lisa's presence, Michelle's work. I mean, Anthony he released not on parole, but yeah, there's something there.
Thanks, Ben. And you teed me up nicely for my next question, so thank you. But before I ask the question for Anthony, I just put another anonymous poll in the on your screen, and it's about the nature of the crime. And this is not an official poll. We're not going to publish these answers, folks. There's probably 20 more responses that I could have added in there, but just generally, where do you feel? Where are you landing on whether the nature of the crime should be a factor, and to what extent should it be a factor in making these really important decisions? Okay, Anthony, you're up. A theme that Ben examined is whether correctional facilities are actually designed to correct or rehabilitate people. And he wrote, correctional officers weren't trained to correct people through counseling or therapy. They were only to guard and police. Rehabilitation in the country's prisons was never really attempted. So having served nearly 30 years in a correctional facility, what are your thoughts on those statements?
Beautiful, beautiful question. I'll begin by first thanking Ben for his great work. I mean, I thoroughly read and digested that book there. And the book impacted me in the same way it did when I first read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. And I think Ben's book goes a step further because it doesn't just address the system, but it gets to the why. Like what's at the root of all of this? How did we get here in terms of purpose, and what is reality now in terms of practice? And I think Ben's book addressed that question thoroughly. But no, the system itself is not currently designed to reform, rehabilitate, correct. All of these departments, divisions of correction have very little correction going on in them. There were times throughout my 30 years of incarceration, let's take the Maryland Division of Correction, for example, where it depended on who was in charge of the Department of Correction at that time. If the administrator had a belief in reform, rehabilitation, then the prisons reflected that. But if there was a secretary or a commissioner who did not believe in reform, rehabilitation, then it kind of reflected that as well. And of course, budgetary concerns always plays a part in whether or not programs are administered effectively throughout any prison. So the system itself is not fit to reform, correct, rehabilitate. In fact, most of the, programming and rehabilitation that takes place, at least here in the state of Maryland, are self-driven. The inmate population, the incarcerated population, themselves produce these programs, run and operate and facilitate these programs. So no, the system, at least here in the state of Maryland, can't do it. But thankfully right now we have a secretary over the Maryland Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services that has been visiting the prisons, I mean, recently, and reforming as she moves throughout her journey and implementing her idea and visions of the possibilities. So it really, I mean, it really boils down to what are the budgetary concerns, who's administering or facilitating the facilities. It's possible, but it hasn't been historically a practice at all here in the state of Maryland.
Thanks, Anthony. And isn't it interesting that you note this new secretary, seemingly we're impressed with her because she's visiting prisons, you know, like that's how low the bar is, right? Like she's showing up, she's talking to people, and that is apparently something new. So just wanted to add that commentary there. Okay, did anyone else want to add on to that?
I just wanted to piggyback on your point about the person visiting. We did that during my time. There was time when we went to facilities and saw, you know, the challenges that individuals experience. And again, it was viewed as a major feat. We also spent time visiting transitional facilities for people, you know, or not transitional, but host sites, re-entry houses. We took opportunities to visit those places, to meet the individuals who were on staff, to just see where are we releasing these people to and how can we build relationship with you all. And that was seen as something that was really novel, you know, in the eyes of the executive committee, the confirmation committee here in Illinois. They thought that was just something that was absolutely amazing and completely unheard of, to actually, you know, be involved in the process. But how do we, okay, for Lisa Daniels, how do I make a decision about another person's life, about another person's future, without fully, or at least to the best of my ability, informing myself about all of the things that are connected to that human being before doing so? Or I don't see how anything else is a consideration. I don't understand that. Because I think anything else is just pushing a political agenda. It's just signing off on paperwork. It's just moving the agenda along without actually becoming connected to the process. And that takes work, that takes effort, but more importantly, it takes the desire for human connection. So I'll just put that out there.
Thanks, Lisa. Really important information you just shared, and thank you for doing what you did and what you continue to do. So there are critics of parole reform. Like, let's just tear down the system. Let's just burn it. I almost called this webinar, "Can Parole Be Abolished?" But I was like, oh, that might be a little too far. But here's the question, and it's for all of you, whoever wants to jump in. Critics of parole reform, as discussed in Ben's book, says that parole reforms legitimize an inherently racist and dehumanizing carceral system by trying incrementally to better it. So should we try to rehabilitate parole, or is it beyond salvation? Should we just do something else? Or should we focus on getting people back in front of judges, like second look laws? So who would like to start?
Yeah, I'll go first, because and I want to preface my answers by saying I'm speaking specifically as it relates to the state of Maryland, and even more specifically the population of people who are serving life sentences in the state of Maryland. We are not advocates of abolishing any form or mechanism that could potentially lead to release. So while there are challenges, absolutely, we are not in favor of abolishing, but doing the necessary work that it takes to reform and rehabilitate the system. And I really don't think we have to look no further than the state of Maryland to answer that question affirmatively, right now, as we speak, the Maryland Parole Commission is being rehabilitated. It is transforming right now before our very eyes, specifically in terms of the lifer population. In 1993, an inmate who was on parole, some sort of parole release, committed a murder and suicide of himself and the young lady he was with. And as a result, all inmates, 134 that were out on that same form of release, were brought back into the system. That's 1993. In 1995, Maryland's former governor, Glenn Dennett, announces as a result that he's not paroling anybody serving a life sentence unless you are old or terminally ill. So from 1995 all the way up to 2019, we were active, we were engaged, first inside of the prison system and connecting with advocates and organizations outside of the prison. Every year since 1995, with the exception of 1 year, 1998, we introduced legislation in the Maryland General Assembly to remove the governor from the parole process. So it took us till 2019 to actually make that legislation a reality. So we were advocating legally. There were all kinds of motions, petitions, writs. We were filing for decades. And there were court decisions, opinions here with favorable language that we continue to use. So we advocated legislatively, legally for almost 30 years. And now the Maryland parole system, the Maryland Parole Commission is at the point where all of that advocacy is paying off right now, right? Since the governor was removed in 2019, over 100 inmates serving life sentences have been paroled in the state of Maryland. That has never happened before since the 1960s. So we're at a historical moment right now where the chairman of the Maryland Parole Commission, just last week, they were visiting prisons, asking inmates if they wanted to waive the risk assessment evaluation, which was a part of the parole process that took a 2-year waiting period just to get there. So right now, as a result of decades of advocacy work, the Maryland Parole Commission is showing signs of reform and rehabilitation. But it takes a consistent effort, a consistent partnership between those who are inside, the advocates and organizations who are on the outside, fighting as we strategize legislatively, executively, and legally, all simultaneously. And eventually, I mean, we're starting to see the fruit of that effort. So yes, I believe the system can be reformed, but it's unfortunate that it takes decades of work to get to this point.
Okay,
Michelle?
so Anthony's vote. Oh, I'm sorry, Ben. I was just
I was
summarizing.
gonna-
Anthony's
you were
vote is
gonna-
yes, keep parole. Go ahead. Sorry.
Michelle, did you want to go next, or 'cause, I mean, I feel like Anthony in many ways, and I'll sort of just think historically that mass incarceration, the era we're in now, is about 50 years old. And at the start of this time, we had 200,000 people in prison across the country. Now we have about 1.2 million. And among those 200,000, so the same as the entire prison population back then, have life sentences or so many years that it's the equivalent of the same thing. So even if you believe in abolition of the entire prison system, what about these people who are going to die in prison unless there's some mechanism, some release valve that we think of? And those are just the people serving the most extreme sentences. You know, that's not kind of people serving 30 years and 20 years and 15 years. And so, yeah, how to reckon with that? So we could sort of pass laws that attack things like truth in sentencing and mandatory minimums to change those. That's going to take a while. And so I don't think, you know, in terms of like resentencing and parole, I feel like that's a false choice in some ways. I mean, unless we have limited, if we imagine that we only have limited political capital and actual like dollars, state dollars, and what to invest in, we see some of the same problems, unfortunately, in judges who are doing resentencing hearings, that you go to them and they end up giving life sentences on a resentencing hearing, or sentences so long. It feels like to repeat what Anthony said of like, and I'll sort of back up. I'm in Illinois where we don't have parole any longer, and I'm taking in many ways what I'm saying, my guidance from people who are in prison here. I teach in prison, and I work with a group inside several prisons who created an organization called Parole Illinois, and they have no chance to get out, and they're demanding. They see parole as the safest and most palatable for the rest of the country's solution to changing laws to give them an opportunity to get out. They're going to die in prison unless there's some law change. They're amazing people. They're writing books. They're phenomenal. And they're now in their 20th, 30th year of incarceration. And so something I'm taking the guidance from them. I think what they sometimes don't hear is like when I'm doing panels like this and talking to people in California and New York and others where there is parole, of being like, no, you don't want this. This is so dramatic. But actually having the opportunity as a first step, and then believing what Anthony just said, that hopefully that system could be reformed enough that it's at least it's one more release valve in this system where we have these hundreds of thousands of people who need something.
Thanks, Ben. Michelle, Lisa. Michelle.
Lisa, you want to jump in? You want me to go? Okay. I mean, I completely agree with everything that Ben and Anthony just shared. I mean, I think that in New York, the release mechanisms are so limited, and something like clemency, which is another potential release mechanism, is so underutilized, is so political, is so difficult to obtain. So I'm certainly in the camp of, parole is a mechanism by which people who have served long sentences can get out of prison, and we need every mechanism we can possibly get our hands on. So all that to say, like, listen, I'm an abolitionist at heart. I want to burn down every prison in every way. And I want people to be able to walk out still, right? I want people to be able to be reunited with their families and to be free. And I feel like there is kind of this national shift a little bit happening towards more focus on sentencing reform and on second look provisions, and sort of moving away from this post-incarceration kind of parole back end, focus. And if there are any funders on here, I want to just make a plea and say, please still fund parole work and still support and invest in radical changes to these systems. Parole Prep and our sister organization, RAP, the Release Aging People in Prison campaign, which maybe many of you are familiar with. I think we have been pushing for parole or changes in parole for years now and have seen success. So the other part of it too is that, like, with community power and with organizing and with a lot of political momentum, I think we can actually shape these systems in the way that we want to. And obviously, like, the backlash and the racism and the white supremacy and all of the weight of the system is against us many times, but we still do have small victories. People are getting out, people are coming home. We are able to get new commissioners on the parole board. So even in days when I feel a lot of despair and people I love are getting denied parole, like, I still believe that there is going to be a future in which everyone who is inside doing long sentences is coming home and is with their family and loved ones. The other thing too, I'll say, and this is not to like throw a lot of shade at the second look kind of movement happening across this country, but I personally don't trust judges to do good things. I don't think that they are any better or any more qualified than parole commissioners to make release determinations or resentence people. And I have a lot of suspicion about, judges' capacity to really evaluate people and to resentence people to reasonable sentences, whatever we want to decide that those are, if we believe in that. And so I think that's also my other concern, is that, judges are just as corrupt and racist and problematic as parole commissioners, as anyone else administrating, a part of the criminal legal system. So I think for me, it's hard to imagine putting my faith in judges when we're talking about long sentences and people dying in prison. So do I like parole? No. Do I want to abolish it? Not yet. Not until everyone's home and we can abolish the whole system.
Thanks, Michelle. Lisa, did you have anything to add? Yeah, you're not touching this one. It's cool.
No.
Okay, I am going to launch our next question for the audience. Now that you've heard some thoughts and concerns about the parole process, if you had the choice, it's your friend, it's you, it's someone you know, it's just society in general, you get one chance, would you advocate for better parole laws or second look laws or neither? Okay, next, Ben, we're going to shift the conversation now to talking about victims. You wrote an entire section in your book about victims and talked about how the victims' right movement began. And I had learned myself for the first time that the US is the first country to allow victims to speak at parole hearings. So can you talk a little bit about the history of that movement?
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I learned a lot writing this too, and it's a fascinating history. And much like what I was saying about the history of parole itself, it begins as a reform and gets twisted into something that is excessively punitive. Um, it begins really in the 1970s with feminist organizing, with women who were either victims of domestic abuse or rape, who were being re-victimized by the criminal justice system, and feeling like they needed additional rights. And it moves from there to grassroots groups of people who suffered incredible loss and gathered together in their despair. You know, groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, Parents of Murdered Children, which start as local groups and then become national lobbying groups. And this gets taken up by conservative advocates, and really sort of pushing against a kind of liberalism that they felt was in the country and in the Supreme Court, and things like additional rights for in search and seizures and other things that they were pushing up against. And it becomes not just advocating for supporting crime victims, but the flip side of that, which is for longer and more certain sentences and fewer opportunities for release. That's how it evolves. Really, by the 1980s, by the start of the 1980s, Ronald Reagan is president, and he's having a victims' rights week, and creating these organizations and funding national organizations. And I'll say that the victims' rights movement, of that evolution over just a couple decades to today, I think it just really defines everything about our justice system today, about our laws, and really about our culture and how we think of crime and how we think of punishment. The prevailing idea that defines almost everything is like fear, like you should be afraid, and that you should believe in revenge and vengeance. And that emergence from this, I mean, you could say that always existed in our culture in some ways, but this is really crystallizes it. And the thing that is sort of most troubling and problematic about the victims' rights movement is it completely obscures who a victim is. Not completely, but people suffer terrible crimes. They suffer from violent crime. But like every one of those laws that's named for someone, like Megan's Law, every single one is named for a white crime victim. And it kind of limits, it defines who a crime victim is in a very narrow sense, of when we who should be afraid and who we should be afraid of, because the people who are suffering the most crime, who are the most often the victims, are the ones who are then suffering the sort of extra punitive laws that come out of this. Yeah, and that's the history of our country. That's the thing we're wrestling with. And that's actually, when we talk about whether we want more parole or more resentencing, we really have to change that culture. If we're constantly reacting to the next crime, which there's always going to be a crime. And if we're using these exceptional cases to legislate the rule, the exception becomes a thing that we all, that dominates everyone's experience.
Thank you, Ben. Did anyone want to add to Ben's comments?
Yes, I mean, during the last decade of my incarceration, I served as president of the Lifers Conference, an inmate organization that represented the need and interests of inmates serving life sentences. And one of our annual events, every year we hosted an event in recognition of National Crime Victim Rights Week. Every year during the month of April, an entire week is dedicated to National Crime Victim Rights Week. So every year we brought in all of the leading victim rights organizations and advocates here in the state of Maryland to talk about victim rights, victim awareness. We hosted them all. Maryland Crime Victims Resource Center has been mentioned, Family Mothers Against Drunk Driving. We partnered with the Victim Services Unit for the Department of Public Safety, all of the state's attorneys' Victim Services Unit. We brought them all in because we recognize that there's always an important part of the conversation for victims' rights. But as Ben so eloquently pointed out, it's unfortunate that that important subject has been hijacked by special interest groups who are not really concerned about victims' rights at all, and are promoting their own personal agendas through that lens, through that narrative. So while it is an absolutely important part of the conversation, we have to find a way to regain control of the narrative in terms of what role does this play in the evaluation of an offender in terms of his maturity and rehabilitation in the system as a whole.
Thanks, Anthony. Lisa.
They actually just kind of summed it all up. And even though I can sit in the seat of a survivor of violent crime, I think Ben and Anthony really did sum it all up. I think if I could add anything, it would be that to highlight Anthony's point about the special interest groups and the political agenda. Let's not forget that kind of work hand in hand with the special interest groups in furthering the fear-mongering agenda. My heart's desire is that the survivor community wake up and discontinue to internalize the fear, and understand that it all is simply a political agenda, and that it is an effort to further the political agenda. The idea that, you know, these are the things that we need you to stand in the forefront with us on, so that you'll feel safer in your community. And the fact of the matter is that when the man that was convicted of murdering my son and sentenced to 15 years for second-degree murder, none of that made me feel safer. I didn't even feel unsafe, actually, because he was, before he got sentenced, I didn't feel unsafe because the man that murdered my son, what had not been convicted yet. There are lots of reasons to not feel safe in this community or in any community, particularly in the city of Chicago. And longer sentences are not inflicting longer sentences and sentence enhancements and all of the tough on crime agenda. None of that supports me feeling safer when, carjackings are on the rise and things of that nature. None of that makes me feel safer. So someone being denied parole, Ronnie Carrasquillo is a perfect example, was convicted in 76,
76, yeah.
76, Ben, for killing a police officer, and he was just released in October of last year. I'm not real smart enough to do the math on that real quick, so anybody that can do it would jump right in. But I never felt safer in the city of Chicago because Ronnie Carrasquillo was never getting denied, was never getting granted parole. And I think that it is important for individuals. Thank you so much. I said 46, Lisa. 46 years, for the 46 years that he was incarcerated did not make me feel safer. And I think that it's important for the survivor community to be educated on what's true, and to be educated on what the political landscape really is after, what it is really,
That's right.
what it is really supporting. And it is really only supporting its own agendas, and it's not supporting the agenda of the survivor community or the incarcerated community. It's not. It is simply supporting its own agenda.
Thanks, Lisa. And we're almost out of time, but I really want to ask this last question, and it's for you again, Lisa. And it's about restorative justice and how can we help victims better navigate this process? You know, I think we've set up a system for so long that that we advertise and promote that keeping the offender incarcerated for as long as possible is how I honor my person, right? But there are other ways, as you know. So how can we make this better instead of it? There are a lot of victims that don't want to hold on to this, to this hate, revenge, suffering. Some do, but a lot don't. And what can we offer them? How can we make this better?
Unfortunately, I want to say real quick, unfortunately for those that do, the challenge often is that it validates their own experience. And there's this fine line between understanding what the grief process and or the fact that there is that it is possible to have two things that can exist in the same space. I can have grief over the loss of my son Darren every single day and still have joy in life. And that and my grief, neither my grief nor my joy are contingent upon the punishment of another individual. I get to decide what that looks like for me. And I think that what's important is that information, that way of thinking, that possibility of life after loss is promoted in all of the work that this criminal legal system does. I think it's important that individuals who have experienced the loss of life or a loved one, or even the loss of someone through mass incarceration, because there are individuals who live that every day. You know, this loved one is never coming back. I always remain transparent and accountable for my son and the experience that cost him his life. And had he not died that day, because he was on under incarceral supervision at the time, he would be in prison right now, or very, very likely to have served a sentence, because he was on mandatory supervised release at the time that he got shot and killed in the midst of committing a robbery. And so it's important to understand that I get to have life too, and it cannot be contingent upon the punishment the punishment of another individual. And I think when more survivors groups, that's a whole nother webinar for me. But when more survivor groups begin to focus on educating the survivor community on things other than focusing on their pain, but actually living beyond the trauma of the experience, which is what we do in shameless plug, the I Am Enough group that our organization actually facilitates. We teach women of color about the trauma that they experience simply by being women of color. And the fact that you've lost a loved one to gun violence or incarceration is a blip on your screen. And if you understand that, you understand that you got layers and layers and layers of stuff that you have to contend with, that this country will continue to layer upon you. You'll make a beeline to begin to look for options to heal from that grief, so you can focus on the other stuff and don't get caught up getting hit upside your head with something else like intersectionality, misogyny, and racism, and all of the things that we experience as women of color in this country. Restorative justice is an opportunity to connect with humanity. And as long as we're willing to do that, we can see the humanity in the people that have contributed to the harm that we're experiencing. And when we can see ourselves in other people, I feel like we can begin to treat people differently, and we can begin to want more for not just the others, not just for those who have caused harm, but for ourselves who have actually experienced.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. Thank you for sharing your experiences. And thank you, everyone, all the panelists, for being here and sharing your thoughts. We are at time. I have many more questions, and we didn't get to any of your questions. So this is what we'll do. We will send out this recording. I think we can send out the chat. I will find out. If we can, we will. And we have all of your questions, and I'll do my best to answer them if we can. But yeah, stay tuned for the email, and please fill out the post webinar survey and give us some feedback. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you so much.